strip search is one of the most intrusive powers at the police's disposal. The use of the tactic on children is now the subject of intense scrutiny. There was the case of a 15-year-old black girl on her period who was strip searched by police at school in Hackney after teachers wrongly thought she smelt of cannabis. Without her mum with her or even being told, child Q was made to remove her sanitary towel and spread her legs. A safeguarding report said racism was a likely factor in what happened to her. The Children's Commissioner for England used her legal powers to demand Metropolitan Police figures for intimate searches of children. Between 2018 and 2020, the Met strip searched 650 children. They'd been stopped and searched but not arrested. The vast majority were boys and 58% were black. 23% of the strip searches were done without a parent or appropriate adult present. Half the time, children were let go without any further action. And that, according to Dame Rachel de Souza, suggests strip searches are not always justified, but are always, in her words, traumatising. Sace Holmes-Lewis is a South London youth worker who's supported young people who've been strip searched. He also advises the Met on building relationships with communities, but says strip searches are a huge barrier to restoring faith in the police.
This is state-sanctioned child abuse, and unfortunately this is something which is reflective of how we've been policing our communities, especially Black British people. And the fact of the matter is that these are young people at the end of the day. They're children who should be safe within society, within education, but they're not safe, and that's got to change, and the legislation needs to reflect that vulnerability of our young people.
The Metropolitan Police says it has to balance the need to sometimes carry out intrusive searches with the impact on children, but says it has made changes. The strip search of a child must now be authorised by an inspector. And the force says officers have been reminded there needs to be an appropriate adult, and children should be treated as children.
Well, I've been speaking to the Children's Commissioner for England, Dame Rachel de Souza, about the data she published, and I started by asking what alarmed her most about the figures.
A couple of things concern me. One was the poor state of the data. I couldn't use the 2021 data. It wasn't in a fit state. There was double counting and all sorts in there. Secondly, of these 650 strip searches, this isn't children in custody. This is children who are stopped and searched. These children are aged 10 to 17, 25% of them aged 10 to 15. What really concerned me was that, in about a quarter of them, there was no responsible adult, no adult representing the child. It also concerned me, frankly, that there was a disproportionate number of black boys in the figures. So around 50% of the figures were black boys, rather than from other groups, which was worrying. And finally, I was concerned that in about 50% of the cases, no further action was taken. Now, for such an intrusive, invasive search, you would have hoped that it was done for a reason, and for there to be 50% with no further action was quite concerning.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the basic problem is that the police believe that this is a legitimate way to go about their work, and there is a fundamental question about whether it is ever appropriate to perform what a lot of people regard as a sexual assault sanctioned by the state on children.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, the thing that shocked me the most was that the rules of having the appropriate adult there their own rules were not being kept. So I think that needs to change.
But even with an adult there's got to be a question, hasn't there, about asking children to bend over and cough.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just so degrading.
And I think the fact that over half of these strip searches resulted in no further action makes that point and brings that point home even more severely. Why have we put a child through this when there was no further action needed?
Right, so when the police say to you, well, in half of these cases almost, we are finding grounds for the search, we are then going on to take further action against these children. And that is the reason why we need to do this. What's your answer?
Well, I would challenge that there wasn't a different way to get what they needed in terms of evidence, frankly.
And so, therefore, don't you need political intervention here? I mean, you need a politician, a minister, to say, this is wrong, it's got to stop.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that the work that we've done and the data that we're sharing today will sort of wake people up to the sort of and make them see that this is widespread. It's not a one-off, and to actually start to question what's going on here. First of all, I want the Met's own rules to be kept. I want children to be properly safeguarded and to have an appropriate adult with them. But yes, I absolutely hope that the whole practice is questioned.
And finally, I mean, given how much this is happening, and it is very shocking, do you think there needs to be an investigation as to whether individual officers are abusing their powers for criminal reasons?
Yeah, look, I think what matters. I think where what we're talking about here is accountability, and I hope by raising this issue there will be far greater accountability. I've been given reassurances by the Met Police that things have changed, and that they're improving the way these things are done, the way sign-off of these things are done. I want to see that greater accountability embedded. Again, let's get back to what we're actually aiming for. We're trying to make sure that children can have trust in the adults in authority, the police, whose job it is to keep them safe, and to make sure that their well-being is paramount. That's the aim I'm trying to achieve.
Rachel de Souza, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I also spoke to the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, Sir Peter Fahey, and I began by asking him whether he's shocked by the figures.
Not really shocked, but certainly disturbed by obviously the level of the number of these searches, but also what it tells us about the number of young people that have been drawn into violence and into being vulnerable through drug gangs. So I think what these figures reflect, not only obviously police tactics, but the fact we have a failed drug policy, we have real problems with youth violence. Black young people sadly disproportionately feature in some of that violence.
Well, that's a very interesting spin, but I mean, the numbers don't tell us that at all. I mean, they don't tell us anything about the drug trade or violence. What they tell us about is the number of children who are being abused by police officers.
No, I don't agree. I think it shows that the police have put a lot of concentration, quite rightly, into trying to reduce the number of young people, particularly in London, who've been victims of knife violence, and the number of young people that have been drawn into the county lines drug phenomena, where organised crime gangs are using young people as couriers. And therefore, we could change some of the rules, we could raise the age of criminal responsibility, but that wouldn't remove the responsibility of the police and other agencies to try and safeguard these young people.
But there are no figures. I mean, there are no figures in this data that shows that these young people are involved in any of the stuff that you're talking about.
No, but we do know, Christian, and that is what's happening. We do know that, quite rightly, there's been a lot of pressure on the police, including from people like the Children's Commissioner, for them to take far stronger line on reducing the number of young people that are murdered, and a lot of concern about the drugs trade.
I think a lot of people find that breathtaking, Peter. I mean, nearly 1 in 4 of these cases were carried out without a responsible adult, a parent, present. What that tells you is not 1 or 2 cases are worrying. It tells you that a huge number of children are being illegally searched by police officers in a very abusive environment, and an environment that the Children's Commissioner says is always traumatizing for all people who are subjected to this. I mean, isn't that the first thing that we should be thinking about here? That this is police officers traumatizing children?
I absolutely accept that. Any stop search, and particularly any strip search, particularly for a young person, is very traumatizing. Why we should do everything we can, absolutely, to reduce those numbers. And I would agree that sometimes the rules about an appropriate adult have not been followed, and particularly more effort should be made to contact parents. But the fact is, I think most police officers feel if you curtail their powers in doing this, it just means that more young people will be used by some of the criminal gangs, because they will believe that if I use a young person to carry a knife or drugs and use them as couriers, then they'll be able to get away with it, and I'll be able to continue my criminal activities.
I mean, you keep talking about violence and knives. The only case we actually know about is a girl who was suspected of having cannabis at school. Now, there are no circumstances in that case where she should have been strip searched, are there?
No, I totally agree with that. And
I bet a lot of them are like that.
Well, I totally agree with that. And I think that's an example of the school calling in the police inappropriately. And I don't think any school should call in the police for things like possession of small amounts of cannabis.
I mean, isn't the problem that, as you highlight, that there are circumstances where even if a parent or carer isn't present, the police can say that they were legally carrying out a search. And the Metropolitan Police have talked about changing the situation so that they have to get a senior officer's say-so to go ahead. And what this does is leave parents in a situation where they have virtually no recourse, do they? That their child may have been traumatised by a search that shouldn't have gone ahead, that feels very much like them, like sexual abuse. And there's nothing they can do because the police are telling them it was legal.
Well, I mean, if the public believe that it shouldn't be legal, then clearly the law will need to be changed. But the police themselves would say that would leave children even more vulnerable. I would agree that sometimes, the police use appropriate adults. I'm sure they're very caring professionals, but perhaps more efforts could be made to find the parents and make sure they're present.
I mean, we often talk to you about these sorts of issues, and it always comes back to resource. In the current climate, with the government talking about resourcing the way it is, what chance do you think that criminal justice and policing is going to get anywhere near the resources it actually needs?
I don't think necessarily so. We need more resources for policing. We do need more effort into youth charities, more funding for them, and a recognition that when a child's upbringing fails, when a child ends up in the criminal justice system, ends up in custody, ends up in the care of the local authority, that is a huge expense to the system. And if we can move some of that money earlier into their childhood, identifying children who are vulnerable at a far earlier stage and put the money there, that would save us a huge amount of money later down the system.
Peter Fine, thank you very much.
Thank you.